everybody doing? In the spirit of it being 420, I guess I was expecting my Pokemon to be maybe like a Munchlax, which turns into Snorlax after it eats enough. That's kind of my jam. This is awesome. I think it's my first time speaking at DevOpsDays Portland, and I'm super excited. Okay, so this is me. I think that picture looks a little bit better than here. It's like the focal length. I'm CTO at a local software company called Puppet. Are you familiar with? Okay, that's a thing. That's a thing you've heard of. All right. We do things like the ones and the zeros and all of it. It's quite nice. And that's me on Twitter if anybody wants to follow me or say angry things at me while I'm giving this talk. Or if you're into video games, I'm also that name on Steam and PlayStation Network. I'm just saying, like, if I kill you, which will never happen, like, don't just be like, I know you, asshole. I know who you are. Okay, the dark side of scale. Off to a good start. I'm shutting this down. All right. Okay, scale. All right. Does this scale? Sort of. Does it scale? It's simple. It's well encapsulated, right? Okay, I will grant that it does not perform particularly well. Okay, fair enough. So how about this? Does this scale? Sort of. It's faster. It's significantly fast. Performance characteristics, right, are vastly improved, I think, here. And density's not bad. You can actually pack a lot of these into a fairly small space, right? Like, I think that makes a lot of sense. But, you know, I guess you could kind of look at it and say, well, the total capacity of this thing isn't particularly large, right? Like, you can only fit maximum maybe 2 people on here. 3 if you've seen that movie Biker Boys with Lawrence Fishburne in it. Slow your roll, young blood. That movie's awesome. Okay, so limited, but better. How about this? Does this scale? Is this what scale looks like? You could fit a whole family of delightful Asian people in there. I know, because I'm delightful and I'm Asian. And we had a minivan exactly like this. So, you know, that's better. There's way more cargo capacity. You could do more stuff. That's awesome, right? Like, but, okay, I mean, maybe you have more things that would fit in a minivan. You know, that's not going to help if you're, you know, a company or you're a business or something. How about this? Is this scale? Come on, it's literally a container platform. Like, this is the most scale. This is peak. This is peak. This is peak performance. So this is, I think, is probably, you know, so it does the thing it needs to do. You can fit a lot of stuff in it. It's got reasonable capacity. There's a lot of infrastructure, certifications, standardized training. There's all this kinds of stuff. That seems pretty good, right? So obviously, every single person in here that has a garage has 2 of these, right? Why not? Why not? It's because my questions are idiotic. And if you actually take a step back, if the problem you're trying to solve is moving people around more effectively, there's maybe a more structural solution you need to be thinking about. Maybe we need better public transport. Maybe we need better internet infrastructure so people can work from home. Maybe we need to have better, you know, equitable distribution of economic opportunities. Like, basically what I'm saying is it's not gonna be solved by having more and more like wheeled death machines hurtling through, you know, city streets going like 1,000,000 miles per hour. But it's really easy to fall into the trap, right? Like, I didn't give anybody any indication about like what kind of measure or quantification actually matters to actually define whether any of those things are scalable or not, right? Yet, you all kind of knew what I was asking for. And I don't know if, maybe I think some of you internalize, like, is he talking about speed? Is he talking about carrying capacity? Is he talking about overall number of them that I could have? You had something in your brain that connected with it, but I seeded it with absolutely nothing. That freaks me the hell out, because I think ultimately scale is meaningless. I think it is a unitless word that I think is mostly used to kind of abstractly identify something with being bigger, better, badder, and more awesome, but in a way that I think is actually divorced from maybe an actual problem that a customer of yours might genuinely have, right? Because it doesn't really mean anything to say, like, I got this thing and it's scale. Like, what does that even, does MySQL scale? Does CGI bin scale? Does Linux scale? Does Kubernetes scale? Does Docker scale? I don't even know what that means. And DevNote, that's web scale. Remember when people used to make fun of products that were advertised as like web scale? That was a meme, right? Like that was so outlandish, everyone was just instantly allergic to it, right? Cloud native is the new web scale. That's what I'm saying. I think the thing I will say here is that customers don't buy scale, right? Like they buy what it enables. The more I know about your internal architecture, your internal structure, whether it's technological, whether it's organizational, the less I care. And actually, the more annoying I actually feel. Like, it doesn't matter to me that the way internally you're organized, like the person I'm talking to on the phone can't cancel my account because they have to bounce me to the retention department. Like, I don't care. I just don't want to pay for cable anymore. And it doesn't matter to me whether, like, you know, there's a supply chain issue and the way that you get deliveries into the restaurant is such and something was late and that way you don't have a way to give me the thing that I ordered. But like, I don't care because I'm at an Arby's drive-thru and I just want my Jamocha shake. And it doesn't matter to me that the truck didn't deliver the Jamocha shake. I still want it and I want it in my tum-tum. So the fact that you have this Byzantine amount of scale behind the scenes doesn't really relate to the actual problem that I have in front of me, which is I would like goods and services, and the fact that I'm more exposed to kind of these raw nerves of how complicated all of your shit is, I just find more infuriating than calming, right? Scale is complexity, and I think complexity sucks. I'm not a fan of it. I believe it was Jane Austen that said that it is a truth universally acknowledged that managing fewer things is easier than managing lots of things. I think that was Jane Austen. Yeah, I think so. A lot of Manor Punk fans in here. But I started to ask myself this question though, like if that's true, and that seems like pretty basic, right? I feel everyone intuitively understands that just having more shit is kind of more of a pain in the ass than having less shit. Yet, how come we spend so much of our time kind of inundated with things that talk about like how big and bad and how maximally scalable they could possibly be, right? Like, what happened between the meme era of web scale and the place that we are now in 2019 and kind of the messages that we get and the people that have the biggest megaphones and what are they trying to talk about? What are the platforms that they're trying to pitch? What are the technical keynotes that we see at all these like conferences? Like, what are the kinds of things that they're talking about? And how simple are they? And I think about it, and I'm like, I'm not sure that they really are that simple. And I think we ended up in sort of a weird spot where we've gotten to this point in the industry where scale, as abstract as it may be, is oftentimes exalted as this sort of paramount virtue, right? But I think the more stuff you have is more of a pain in the ass. It's more things to wrap your brain around. It's, you know, the more complicated an architecture is, the more moving parts there are, the more things that need to interlock with each other, the more sites you have, the more software packages are involved in getting anything done. It's harder to understand what's going on. You know, it's harder to monitor, it's harder to introspect, it's just harder to get sort of basic situational awareness of what's happening because it's really, really confusing, right? And that doesn't feel good to me. I think if I think about a very basic, like kind of a distributed architecture, you know, that's au courant for people that are building things, right? Like even the most simple task is going to involve me having to touch like 8 or 9 different things to do something as basic as upgrading a different version of my software or figuring out what crashed and what went wrong, correlating stuff across a bunch of different services. So at the point that even the most mundane thing that I'm trying to do now involves me juggling 8 different things, like at what point is that actually progress? And at what point have we just like gone to some place where I don't understand why everything looks like shit now? I think there's a fascination with having more stuff. And I will raise my hand here and admit that I am sort of a recovering addict to scale, right? Where I love going into a data center and seeing like racks and racks and racks of stuff. I like this abstract idea that I have things running in like millions of different places. Like it feels kind of cool. But as a practical matter, I think it causes me a lot of problems and it weighs heavy upon my soul and stresses me out in a lot of different ways. I think the easiest server to monitor is one that does not exist. Right? Like the easiest server to secure is one that does not exist. The easiest server to debug and troubleshoot is one that does not exist. So what does that say when so many of our answers architecturally, or so many of the patterns that are now au courant, imply that we need to add all of these additional components, right? Scale is very disorienting. I think as a recovering addict, I think I realized something about myself when I took a step back. And it's that I felt that at a certain point I was building a lot of systems and I was so divorced from the actual metal. Not literal metal, but you know what I mean. Divorced from the metal, and I was working on top of so many different frameworks, so many different layers, so many different APIs, so many different orchestrators that, you know, I genuinely wondered whether me or whether all of us writ large, if kind of like, I worried that I forgot what simple actually looks like. So there's this, I mean, I'll be honest, so, like, would I even notice it if I saw it? There's this, there's a startup that I advise in Denver, which is where I live, and they're part of this, the Techstars Denver Sustainability Accelerator. It's all companies doing like sustainability and ecological projects in concert with the Nature Conservancy. And it's all for-profit companies, but they're doing like ecological stuff. So one of the ones I'm an advisor for, they do things where they track usage for water meters if you're doing farming. So farmers take pictures of their water meters, it sends it to a central system, it can compute reports and stuff like that, and then give you readouts to let you know if you're over-irrigating, if you're irrigating beyond what you're allowed to irrigate and things like that. So, you know, it all sounded really cool because the whole idea is it helps conserve water, right? Which turns out, water, it's a big deal. We kind of need it. We are mostly it, so it's kind of nice. I was talking to them about what their infrastructure looked like. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, how is it built? And they're like, well, the photos go into like Gmail, like a Gmail account, which we check, and we generate a bunch of reports with the script on a laptop, and that just gets sent up to Dropbox, and people have links where they can go and they can collect them. And my initial reaction was just like, whoa, that is so basic. Like, that can't possibly work. Like, that's just so much digital duct tape. There's no possible way that that could function. But then I stepped back and I was like, wait a minute, if the problem's not with them, I think the problem is with me. I think I looked at like what quite possibly could be considered the most simple possible solution to this problem that involves the least amount of labor, literally like zero infrastructure beyond a single laptop, which they already had to have anyway to do a bunch of other stuff. And it was working because they were making money. So I was, you know, simplicity couldn't have been staring me more in the face, and yet my initial reaction was one of like, oh, but what's gonna happen if, oh, but what's gonna happen if, like, oh, what if like two people, what if, and it was ridiculous. Because none of those things were actual problems that they genuinely had. And they were able to meet their needs super simply. And I look at that, and then I look at what I did next, which was, they asked me, they were like, well, you know, what would, if I wanted to do it right, what would the infrastructure for this thing kind of look like? And I'm like, okay, well, you know, I drink the cloud native Kool-Aid like everybody else does, I suppose. So it's like, what's sort of the reference architecture for these things? So the demo app that's really popular if you're going to be building sort of a cloud native microservice to the max is the one from Weaveworks. They call it the sock shop. For those of you familiar with the Java pet store of yore, this is basically a version of that, only instead of selling pets, which I will say not a great business model to sell pets online, you know? That's the reason why Java was in decline. All the way down to being apparently the #1 most popular programming language on planet Earth, but who knows? So I look up the sock shop, and you know, there's a GitHub repo, you can check it out. It's got all these components. So like, okay, this seems pretty simple, right? Like it's a shop that sells socks. Like that seems pretty basic, pretty good match for a pretty basic website these people want to build. And then the WeaveWork folks built a tool called WeaveScope, which handily you can use to actually dive in and tell you what the topology of the thing you just deployed looks like. And it ends up looking like this. And this is filtered. This is actually only showing half of the nodes that should be on here. You can see it in the lower left-hand corner that a bunch of them are actually filtered. And I took a step back and was like, this is the opposite of everything that I want. This is like 400 different things, I think, conspiring to what I assume is ultimately rip some information out of like 3 different rows in a database and then put it in a template and then put some HTML in a web browser somewhere. I'm really struggling. I can't even name 49 different kinds of socks, so I'm struggling why you need 49 different servers in order to make that actually happen. Like, so I don't, I'm always curious, I'm curious how we got to this point, right? Where nominally a lot of these reference architecture types of things, from the very beginning, are optimized for doing all this shit that makes no damn sense to me. In the beginning, I think life was a lot simpler. Like, I think you have a container. That makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like, I quite like them. They're pretty nice. And that seemed very simple, conceptually very simple. It did a lot of things, and it did a lot of things pretty well. But then the next problem is, well, now that I can put something in a container, well, now everyone's telling me I need to take the one thing that was in a container, and I need to split it up into a bunch of different ones. Because you can't have more than one thing in the same one. That's bad for reasons. I don't know what those reasons are, but it's just bad for reasons. And then once you have enough of them, what do? Well, you need to have something that ties them all together. You need to have some kind of platform to run them on, right? Because you don't want to be dealing with all 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 of them manually. So you put them on a container orchestrator that handles a lot of the basics. It can restart things for you if they stop. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I think I kind of had that problem under control before I went on to the orchestrator, but it's cool. It's cool that you can do it, and I could project forward and see how a capability like that would genuinely be useful. But now that I have all these things on there, well, the way networking works has to be totally different because the platform does not expose the same kind of networking primitives that you would expect if you weren't running on it. Okay, that's fine. So now I need to investigate container native networking. And what do I do if I actually want to talk to like a disk, which is handy to have with computers? Okay, well, you can't just have a disk attached to them. You got to have a volume claim that you attach to these things, and you have to decide whether it's persistent or not. And if it's persistent, those are only supported by certain storage backends. So okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. And that's all part of the auspices of the container storage subsystem, so that's all fine. And now let's say I got it all running. Now in order to figure out what the hell is happening, like I can't just run like PS or top. I need to be running some kind of like monitoring system like Prometheus, right? And then I have to go into that. And then in order to figure out when something went wrong, in order to find a log, I don't know which container to log into because you don't log into a container, you idiot. You can't do that. I'm like, can I run tail? You don't run tail, stupid. That's not what you do. What you need to do is get yourself some distributed tracing. You need to rub some tracing on it. You need to rub some Fluent D on that shit. You need to get some Jaeger going. And I'm like, that is not the Jaeger that I need, but there is definitely Jaeger that I need at this point. Like, so, you know, it's, so it's insane. Oh, and then, you know, finally at the end, in order to actually handle all of this stuff, now that I have a completely different, completely orthogonal set of tools that do the same things that I used to be familiar with, but now they operate in totally different ways with the totally different affordances and totally different user interfaces. In order to make sure that, you know, it's not enough to just like have an IP address for all of them. You have to have like ingress, and you have to have like a service mesh, and that's when you get into like, I gotta use Istio or Envoy. It's like even the names of these, I'm like, Envoy sounds like a pharmaceutical, you know? It sounds like a sleeping pill. Or maybe a network laxative. Envoy. It loosens your, I don't know. You don't want to know. Yeah, service mesh. It's good though, it's good. It works for Lyft. So I think for a lot of these things, I take a step back and it feels like you add an additional layer to solve a problem, and then that new layer presents new problems, which of course are solved by adding an additional layer that solves that problem, right? There's that saying that every problem in computer science can be solved by adding an additional level of indirection, except the problem of having too many layers of indirection, right? And I think that's real. I'm not anti-abstraction, right? Like, abstraction is a necessary conceptual tool, I think, that's like as old as computing itself, or mathematics itself, really, right? Like, we all, I think, in a very real way, I think, strive for and crave to have higher level abstractions that help us accomplish more while doing less. But I think the problem is not all abstractions are created equal, and a great many of abstractions are pretty leaky. So I think I find myself in situations like this where I end up with this weird Jenga tower full of brittle bullshit that I don't understand, but somehow simultaneously looks really great on my LinkedIn profile. How many of you have ever used the programming language Stack Overflow? All right. So I was talking with some of the folks from Stack Overflow a while back, and I was talking to them about what kind of infrastructure they use to run Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow, as of 2019, their most recent update, runs on 34 servers. Physical servers. Things you actually can buy and touch and put in places. 34. Less than the sock shop. Only Stack Overflow doesn't sell socks. What it does is be the 45th most heavily trafficked website in the history of humankind. How many of you are working on a problem that you think puts you in a level of scale that is greater than or equal to the 45th most heavily trafficked website of all time? All right, there's a handful of you. And there's gonna be. Like, I think that makes sense, right? But for those of you who did not raise your hand, I think it is an important benchmark to consider in the complexity war, right? I'm not gonna stand here and tell like Google that you need to run everything on 34 servers, right? Like, that's outlandish. That doesn't make any sense. What I am gonna tell you is that most of you are not Google, right? Like, I just don't think you are. And that's completely okay. I think scale is wasteful. And I think it's very easy to kind of get into this mode of digital doomsday prepping, where I need to anticipate all of these things that could happen. Maybe you don't have no idea what the actual likelihood of these things happening actually are, but you need to have all these prophylactic measures in place in order to prevent the catastrophe that might be coming. These are the, like, you have to build your fallout shelter, and you have to build your auto-tracking laser turrets to shoot down meteors that are going to be hurtling towards you with a 0.0001% chance of actually doing anything. But nobody ever got fired from building too much reliability into the system, right? But I think that 99.9, I think 4 nines of availability is unneeded for 4 nines of apps. And honestly, if you believe the statistics, here's the required availability that you're actually gonna need. Like, most software projects fail, and like, very few software startups actually end up succeeding. So you're gonna have like the good times for a little bit where you've got 90+% availability, and then you're only gonna need 0% availability because you'll probably be bankrupt. The good news though is that point is the ideal time. That is the ideal time to do all of your thought lording. That's when you wanna do it. That's when you wanna do it. I think that scale is impersonal. And I think we need more kind of the human touch in tech and not less. And this might be a little sort of naive and maybe a plea to emotion. I'm a recovering user of this analogy. I'm sure you all have heard the analogy of pets versus cattle, I assume. That's sort of a DevOps state. Has anyone not? Everyone knows? Okay, well, there's a few. So the idea is, if you consider all of these animals to be pets, you can only have a certain number of them, right? Because they all have names. If anything happens to them, you kind of want to take care of them. You want to heal them. So the idea is, for scale, you need to start thinking about them as cattle, which is they don't necessarily have names. Maybe you tag them with a number. And I've stood up in front of stages, on stages and like with large crowds, and I've used this analogy. But I never stopped to think about like the logical conclusion of that, which is like, if you go from pets to now starting to think about everything in terms of cattle, like the ultimate, like the end result ends up looking more like a factory farm, I think, which I think is really depressing, right? And it's really clinical. And I think that mentality has ended up permeating, I think, a lot of what happens in sort of large-scale operations, or the companies that I think we tend to vaunt as doing operations the best, is I think they're ops factories. I think they're ops factories that have factories full of little computers, where the little computers themselves are factories for all the containers that run inside of them. And they hire so many ops people that we now have factory workers going to work in ops factories. And I find that like really kind of depressing, I think, in a lot of ways. And yet I think that's true for many of us, where a lot of people in the world go to work in a giant ops factory as factory workers, carrying pagers, burning out by the thousands. And when we do, we're replaced by someone with the same certifications, the same keywords on their CV, experience with the exact same pieces of technology, who passed the same brain teaser interviews. And I think that sucks. So are we the baddies? Like, how did we get here, right? Like, it didn't just happen overnight. So I would like to give you a brief tale of two candidates, I think. This was from a while ago. They came in, they were interviewing. One candidate, it's for like an operations position. One candidate, she on her CV says, hey, I have a ton of experience. I worked at this place, I managed thousands of systems, I have all this experience with like all these like modern pieces of technology, modern programming languages. Damn, that's pretty sweet. Other candidate, her CV talks about how she worked in a place where she was managing a couple of hundred systems. It was all like Java and maybe some Perl stuff or something like that. Which one, you don't have to answer. Instinctually, if you were that hiring manager, which one sounds more impressive? Now, why does that sound more impressive?
Servers, bigger number.
I think the thing that I felt upon reflection that I was optimizing for, it's like I felt like I was almost looking for like Smaug, like someone that knows the most stuff. They were able to hoard the most digital stuff, the shiniest stuff, the best stuff, the largest number of things. When in reality, I should have been optimizing for Marie Kondo, the person who knows the most about containers, I think. And like, that's what I should have been doing. Like maybe candidate number 2, the reason why she only had to deal with 250 servers is because it was consolidated down from 1,000. That's a reduction in complexity. Maybe it was a standardization effort or something like that. Maybe the fact that they're using more boring technology actually means that they tended to pride more choices in terms of like easy access to troubleshooting, well understood patterns for how you deal with it. Maybe that made more sense to her. I'm not saying that's right for every possible situation, but the thing that shocked the shit out of me was that I didn't even think about that. And I really should think about that. And if I should think about it, maybe some of you should be thinking about it. I think we fetishize complexity. And historically, I've viewed complexity as this inevitable thing, right? Like no matter what piece of software you have, no matter what your infrastructure looks like, the bigger it gets, it's just going to get more complex. But I actually don't think that's the case anymore. I think I've changed my point of view on that, which is I think simplicity is a garden. It has to be tended, otherwise it's going to get overgrown and overrun. You have to take like principled, deliberate action in order to maintain a level of simplicity in all the things that you operate and all the things that you manage. Otherwise, the natural inclination is that it's going to end up getting way more complex. One of my favorite quotes about complexity is this one. Complexity is like a bug light for smart people. We can't resist it, even though we know it's bad for us, because the stuff is just so cool to work on. I also think we love to, certainly I do this, is we love to catastrophize, I think. And I think we tend to think about, are we building systems in such a way that actually solves a problem a user cares about? Or is the main thing I'm actually trying to do is sort of build like an infrastructure panic room, where it's resilient to every possible contingency that could ever come up? Because if I think about it that way, of course I need all of the things in order to achieve that end. But it's worth maybe taking a step back to think, is that something that the end user actually cares about? So now what? Well, I feel that we have kind of normalized the level of complexity that we are all willing to tolerate. Like there's a certain base, like almost like background radiation of complexity, I think, that maybe it's hard for a lot of us to even notice anymore because it's just sort of accepted. That's the way that it should be, right? And I think because of that, we have to take kind of pretty principled, deliberate actions in order to kind of claw our way back. One of the things that I've been using a lot lately, if you've never heard of it before, is the idea of YAGNI, which is you aren't gonna need it. Which is funny because this used to be like a very popular saying, I think, in software engineering circles, maybe like 10 to 15 years ago, popularized by Martin Fowler amongst a couple of other people, where it's like you don't really necessarily need to have all of this stuff, right? You don't necessarily, it's good to think a little bit ahead, but you don't need to think so far ahead and then code that in like right now. Because honestly, your ability to predict what's gonna happen and steps ahead is probably a lot lower than we think we can. I always think it's funny if someone gives me an estimate for something and it's beyond like 6 months. I'm like, that may as well be forever. Like, we have no precision there. I think another thing I would encourage people to do is to resist the urge to be clever. And I think this is hard. This is hard for me. Like this, I'm being real. This is super hard for me to do myself because I enjoy the feeling that I get when I feel like I've done something clever. As Kernighan would say, everyone knows that debugging is twice as hard as writing a program in the first place. So if you're as clever as you can be when you write it, how will you ever debug it? So the way I think about it now is if you're designing a system or you're building out some infrastructure, conceptualize like a complexity budget, a cleverness budget that you have. And like, maybe you should be at like 50% of that. That way, if debugging it is twice as hard, you have headroom. But you won't be able to get there if you're doing all the stuff at peak cleverness all the time. I think we should try to, I think this is gonna take work, but I think we should strive to find beauty in simplicity. The fact that it took me work to find beauty in the way that that company I was talking about architected their systems, like that took work. But once I did it, I think that unlocked a lot of stuff in my own brain about how I think about kind of systems engineering as a discipline and sort of larger architected systems, you know, more comprehensively, right? I think this is also a place where, you know, for those of us that are conference organizers or the places that we go to and the conferences we attend, I think I would encourage you all to like seek out more stories from people that have similar, you know, if you're not at Facebook, like you don't necessarily need to go and listen to how Facebook does a thing because you're probably not going to be Facebook, right? Like, are you building a social network? Well, then you're not going to be Facebook. Are you trying to topple an election? Well, then you're probably not Facebook. Like, it's just facts, man. It's just facts. But I think I would just encourage you all to like mix it up a little bit more and hear more stories from people that look more like you in terms of the work that you do and the kinds of problems that you need to solve and the scale of problems that you have to solve, right? And chances are that's probably not the same composition of people that are in the green room behind the screen at reInvent. Last thing I'll say on this is you do not have to be mighty and you do not have to be big to do big things, right? Like, I think there's sort of a meme where it's like, if you want to do something planet scale, you got to work at a planet scale company. I'm like, I don't think that's true at all. I think there is plenty of room for people to do things that have meaningful impact or that make you happy or that solve some actual genuine problem without needing to have an armada at your disposal to mobilize in order to make that happen. The very last thing I will say is I also think, maybe this is just for me, but I do think I implore you all to, I think it is important as an industry for us to cultivate a certain level of what I would say is media literacy about technology. And I think that's like what kind of blogs we read, who we follow on social media, what kind of speakers we listen to, all those kinds of things. The same way that you would apply media literacy to like news media that you consume or anything like that. How can you be critical about it? Are there conflicts of interest in place from the people that are actually standing up and talking to you? My conflict of interest is I actually make more money the more complicated your shit is. So that's the truth. That's the truth. If everyone was running their infrastructure on a single server, right, and it was a single Rails app, I probably would make a lot less. But I think the industry would be a lot probably better. I think I would sleep better at night. So I have a weird anti-conflict of interest, I guess. But that might not be the case for everyone that you listen to, right? Like, people that work for a company that are giving you a talk on the thing that they built. And they also make money the more you use the thing that they are building and telling you about. I'm not saying that makes the message bad. I'm just saying be a critical listener and understand the motivations and the backgrounds of the things that you consume. And be skeptical of wild-ass claims. I was like trying to find some information for a friend. They were like, what is a Kubernetes? And I was like, okay, well, you know, I Googled it and I found this. And I was like, designed on the same principles that allows Google to run billions of containers a week, Kubernetes can scale without increasing your ops team? I'm like, that doesn't sound right at all. And I was like, that's weird. Maybe I should go find like a better website for, oh shit, this is the actual, that's not good. But this explains a lot. This explains why Google Cloud Platform is run by just one SRE. Which explains a lot about their customer service experience. I kid, not really. The very, very, very last thing I will say before I wrap it up is that I would encourage you all to just, there's no easier way for me to say it. I would love to see you all build more weird shit. You know, I want to see more weird shit. Built in ways that defy modern conventions. Anything a modern convention tells you is the wrong way to do it, I want you to build it in exactly that way. I want you to stand up a server and I want you to SSH into it all day. I want you to run your daemons inside of Screen. You know, like, I want you to do all these things, right? Because I think that's what's going to add like a ton to the overall like level of technological and architectural diversity I think that's out there. Right? Like, you all make music, and, you know, infrastructure is your instrument. So I think you have to think, like, do you want to make punk rock, or do you want to make a corporate jingle? So think about it. I look forward to all the crazy-ass ideas you all have. Required reading that I would heartily recommend. The first one is the Website Obesity Crisis, which is a fantastic talk. You can Google all these, because, you know, I can't put a link and then, like, click the link because it's a projector screen. What I'm saying is the future sucks. Dan McKinley has a really great article on choosing boring technology. Earlier I referenced Martin Fowler's essay on Yagni, and there was one that came out really recently by Appenoir on absolute scale corrupts absolutely, which I thought was actually really fascinating. Like, why do we have, yeah, anyway. I can't do a better job of describing it than he does, but definitely encourage you all to read it if any of this stuff kind of resonates with you or sounds kind of cool. That's all I got. This was the dark side of scale. I will be around, so feel free to accost me with questions or tell me how I'm wrong, but hopefully not. Awesome. Thanks for giving me the time. Appreciate it.